Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon and welcome to KSI's webinar on the GE15 analysis and its implications on Malaysian politics. We'd like to welcome all our guests and speakers to this webinar, fresh out of the elections that we just had in Malaysia 2 weeks ago. We saw great changes in our political landscape, and although the results of the elections are quite well known to us at this point, the meaning behind it all is still quite unclear. How would these results affect decision-making, and how would it affect, more importantly, the following elections to come, such as the state elections, which will take place in a few months' time. So to demystify this topic, we have two very distinguished speakers who have been well quoted in the media and international media as well, joining us for the next hour or so to give us their insight and the analysis on what these election results mean, and how does Malaysian politics move forward. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to my colleague, Mr. Zaim Ozani, who will be moderating this session, and I'll allow him to introduce our speakers as well. Zaim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Woon, for the introduction. Gentlemen, welcome to our KSI webinar. It's been a while since KSI did a webinar, and for your information, KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific is a think tank, a regional think tank based in Kuala Lumpur, and we do over 20 high-level events, summits every single year, ranging from the Malaysia Digital Economy Summit to the ASEAN Leadership Partnership Forum, and many more in between. Also, when I say in between, we also do webinars such as this to discuss current affairs issues, public policy issues, and obviously the 15th general election was a very important moment in our country's political trajectory in history, because we've been waiting for so long for this election to happen ever since 2018, GE14, subsequently the Sheraton move or the political crisis in 2020, and finally we are here today. As Woon mentioned, this has been a very interesting time in our history. To give you an indication, I just returned from Singapore just a couple of days ago, and everywhere I went, I was in the taxi, the Grab, events. Everybody's asking me about what's happening with Malaysia. How's Anwar? How's the government? And so there's a lot of excitement, not just among Malaysians, but also friends from Singapore and beyond. And so to dissect our session, we do have two speakers. And before I get to that, the key questions we're going to explore today are threefold. The first part is, what factors contributed to the GE15 results? What are the factors that led to the rise of Perikatan Nasional and the performance of Barisan Nasional BN? What does it mean in terms of voter sentiment and concerns? That's the first part. Second part is about how will the election affect the future of Malaysian politics, and what does it mean for Malaysians in general? And third, what political developments can we expect in the days and weeks to come in the context of the Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's administration? Today, this evening, we will be hearing about Anwar Ibrahim's cabinet lineup, and I think there's a lot of excitement there. And to kick off the panel, we have two speakers, two very esteemed speakers, Professor Dr. Bridget Welsh, Honorary Research Associate, University of Nottingham, Asia, Research Institute, Malaysia. And Bridget Welsh is no stranger political scene, having written many books and also have made many commentaries about the 15th general election. We also have Dr. O Isan, Senior Fellow of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, also not a stranger in political analysis and also commentaries. To kick off the session, I will invite Professor Bridget Welsh to speak about up to 10 minutes, and then followed by Dr. O Isan, and then we will have a discussion coupled with a question and answer. And so with that, let me pass the floor to Professor Bridget Welsh to kick us off with this webinar.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with all of you, and I'm looking forward to having a good conversation. I'm going to really speak to the different questions that I think are very important to understand what's happening in Malaysia. We've seen two major events in the last few weeks or the last month that I think really deserve attention. And of course, asking also to look towards the future raises all sets of other questions as well. So first of all, I think my analysis of the election has been public. People can look at this, but what we saw is a situation where we had a pivotal role of the campaign, the role of new voters, and a very dynamic competitive process. And we see, of course, a hung parliament, but we also see a situation where we have repolarization, we have the increasing strength of Borneo as a pivotal players in the national process, a changing dynamic as a result of that, the pivotal role of younger voters in determining the results, and of course, sharp divisions and very different visions of what Malaysia signifies. We can go into some of that, and the nitty gritty, the things that want to focus on the rise of of PAS and PN as a political force, the problems with UMNO, the constraints that Harapan face. But I think it's important to look at these sort of broader macro processes, transformations that are taking place. This is an indication of greater democratic governance in Malaysia, but at the same time, also the constraints and the negative dimensions of democratic governance. I have repeatedly said in the course of the campaign and many of the talks that I have highlighted that elections are not the solution to Malaysia's problems, but they are the illustrations of them. And I think we can see some of those dynamics at play. I'm not going to repeat some of the things I say in my articles because many of you have read them, but I think I want to sort of just kind of talk to you about these sort of macro processes. The second sort of real pivotal moment that I think has not been given attention is that we've had the second peaceful transition of power of a government through elections. We've had a number of peaceful transitions of government through coalition transformations in the last few years, but I want to emphasize this because I think that these transitions of power are points of potential conflict and can be destabilizing. And we did see in the days after the election, before the formation of government, high level of intensity of racialized rhetoric, the use of fear, and we saw again another very dynamic process where power and the balance of power shifted in the course of 5 days. What I want to emphasize here is that we now have a situation where the elites ultimately, with certain degrees of qualification, played more responsible roles, the pivotal role of personal relationships, the pivotal role of the royalty, and of course, importantly, not to left out is the calm role of society to not overreact to some of the type of rhetoric that was taking place in Malaysia. This is a pivotal change. I think it speaks to cautious optimism for a kind of new formula. I know that there's a tendency in Malaysia to focus on the negative sides of things, and the things that were not reached because many people were dissatisfied if they were not in government or if they or the compromises that have to be made, especially among the educated elite, and the more engaged political classes. But I think that Malaysia has a lot to be proud of this transition, this peaceful transition of power, and how it has resulted in, I would suggest, a more it forced elites to make pivotal decisions that they might not necessarily had to kind of move away from the politics of the past to a kind of new configuration. And I want to emphasize that that there's a lot of things that happen in this dynamic of personality, but there's also cooperation, new cooperation taking place at the state level, new cooperation taking place at the in terms of kind of having to making elite compromises, and I think that these issues of compromises in some of these relationships have also been evolving. They're not necessarily as new as people think they are, because we've seen some of this in the last post-election dynamics. But of course, with that, our real challenges, because there's potential delegitimation among people's political base, and we've seen particularly the very destabilizing forces. The government that has formed, we can call it a unity government or whatever you would like to call it. I think it's not necessarily a unity government, but some people have become unified. We see a situation where these particular actors represent the larger configuration of representation in the country from the perspective of geography, ethnicity, and also greater inclusion of competent individuals from a perspective of having experienced government. If you look at the composition of PN versus the new government that we see of almost 2/3, a very fragile government, nevertheless, but one that I think is very important. That's the second sort of bigger point that I want to emphasize, we can talk about this transition in a meaningful way. Now, the bigger question, however, is where Malaysia goes forward, and what does this mean for the country? And I think, I stand, despite the real obstacles, as cautiously optimistic about where Malaysia is moving forward. And I think, I know others would have very strong reviews that are different than this, but I think we need to be recognize that what we have seen is that the election result, as well as the peaceful transition of power, speaks to a kind of the importance of pushing for compromise, a kind of focus on a reflection of democratic results, a push for reform against corruption, which I think a lot of the voters who voted for PN were against that. We see a sense of the government that has formed is less insular, it's more globalized. I think that it is the cooperation between Pakatan Harapan and PN offers the best option to reduce some of the polarization that exists within the society and the electorate. And I think that, these are, and not only the polarization from a perspective of Peninsula and Semenanjung, but also polarization and the conclusion of more meaningfully of both Sabah and Sarawak. I think that a different type of PN government would have divided Sabah more meaningfully, and I think would have had more divisions than the part of Borneo. I think this is a more interesting dynamic. We have, Isan can speak to this in a particular way. But it is a fragile government. The numbers are problematic from the perspective of underlying conditions. Let me highlight just a few of those. I think what we see is a role of unconstructive opposition, an opposition that is still desires power, will use all means to try to get to power. We've seen that in the last few days, and I think that will continue to have that. We see very difficult, pivotal decision arenas that where we'll have to face, not least of which is the most immediate is the cabinet formation, but also the GLC appointments or removal of people from GLCs, the issues associated with the parliament vote, managing Zahid's case, managing the role of Zahid in the cabinet itself, the issues associated with different roles of different actors, the UMNO party elections, which are really have already started, and that they're going to extend through that. It is pretty clear that the BN contingent of 30 seats are very divided, and even not some parts of those are not really behind Anwar Ibrahim. And UMNO provides the first major focal point of destabilization of the government in terms of numbers. Although I think, given the overall majority that it exists of 148 or so, I think we can see that UMNO is not necessarily as powerful as it might be, but it is, because it does set the tone, because it is the divisional point. But its leadership problems are very challenging, and of course, all of this is pivoting towards the next the next set of six-part elections, which are going to happen at the state level. All of them are going to be extremely competitive, and the same forces that I said of uncertain results, and new types of formations are going to come about. So I said this cautious optimism of conflicting trends. I do see some important reforms coming out of this potential government, but I think that the early days and are there. I caution that what we've learned from Pakatan Harapan 1.0 is that there needs to be a more proactive approach of presenting ideas and engaging in policy reforms, but a reliance on one person and a focal point around the one person inevitably means that there will be points of disappointment and also points of increasing the issues of destabilization. My view, however, is that there is a bit more cohesiveness of this government compared to among the Harapan partners, and I think that the question will be the issues of common ground. The other big final point that I would raise is the challenge of the economy as being underlying all of this. There is now a space to have more focus and to kind of bring about more reforms if one can get past the shortcomings and the real destabilizing decision points that are to come in the future. I apologize, Zaim, if I've talked too long. I'll close my remarks here. Again, I'm speaking of the broader aspect, trying to look at the broader shifts. And I remind everyone that I remain cautiously optimistic, that I think we have to be very, to look at the role of the young people, to look at the role of a more competitive system, a system that is forcing itself to reform despite the leaders sometimes and despite the circumstances that are coming from it.
Thank you so much, Professor Bridget Walsh. I think you mentioned cautious optimism 4 times, and I think that broadly speaking, I think Malaysians are divided into two sentiments. Some are cautiously optimistic, and some are cautiously skeptical of what's going to happen with the new government. And you also mentioned about the new government being fragile, despite being more diverse and representative of the country. You mentioned of the role of the unconstructive opposition, which is still lasting for power, not being able to move on from the results of the GE15. You mentioned about the challenges of Anwar Ibrahim's government, first being UMNO itself, the end, which is divided factionally. The factions have always been there, and they not powerful, but set the tone. You also mentioned, I think, very importantly, about 6 state elections, which might be a referendum on the new government and could result in new political configurations. And you also mentioned about lessons learned from the PH 1.0 government, that I think the new government in some ways are learning from. And I think the other thing I think you mentioned, and we obviously probably want to talk a little bit more about the role of young voters, young people in this election, which I think much has been said, but I don't know whether they have been insightful. So maybe we can have a discussion on that. So thank you so much for your remarks. Very, very exciting, very interesting. I'll now pass the floor to Dr. Olisan for you to give it to us.
Hi, thank you very much for introducing me. Sorry, I'm in KLIA, and as you could hear, there's some announcement going on. I just got off a very much delayed flight. I think the results of this particular election, number one, is not unique to Malaysia. Namely, you saw it in recent years in a number of countries. You saw it in Germany. You saw it in Israel. You saw it actually briefly in the United Kingdom as well, whereby none of the major coalitions would clinch a majority. And it took, for example, in both the German case as well as the Israeli case, quite a number of months before a government was formed. In Germany's case, there were even various combinations using traffic lights representing different colors of different parties and so on. So I think we are entering that phase also experienced by a number of other countries, both developing and developed, whereby if we were to continue with this sort of parliamentary democracy, it could well be that in some future elections, after some future elections, we would encounter similar situations whereby no single party or party coalition will clinch an outright majority. That, of course, that begs the questions: do we want to have some form of reform of this sort of electoral system? I think Israel briefly experimented with it about 10 years ago, having a directly elected prime minister, but I think they also found it untenable and abandoned the whole scheme within a few years. So I guess for quite some time, we'll be stuck with such a parliamentary democracy where you need to command a parliamentary majority. Various elements have been attributed to the presentation of the results. Sorry, the announcement is coming again. One of them is, of course, there were voters, perhaps they were dissatisfied with UMNO and the PH side as well as the PN side. They had a lot of narratives about allegedly how incorrigible, how corrupt UMNO was and so on. And I think some voters, quite a significant number of voters bought into it. But similarly, they also bought into the narrative presented by both BN and PN that Pakatan is perhaps too liberal, too multicultural, and so on. So by the process of elimination, quite a number of them apparently chose PN, and especially PAS, if not Bersatu. And another contributing factor could be a long-standing process of a number of voters, old and young alike. They align themselves more to the conservative end of the socio-political spectrum in the country, and it is given a more prominent manifestation in this election. Well, going forward, I think Anwar's main challenge would be to hold on to his coalition government, because while he claims to have a two-third majority, I think such a majority, if my home state of Sabah is any experience, could be rather fragile. I could still remember back in 2018 and 19 and even 2020, Shafi Abdal also held a two-third majority in the state assembly, but overnight, quite a number of assembly person decided to not support him and supported somebody else. Even though we have these anti-hopping laws and so on, I mean, individual MPs may not switch their party affiliation, but they could certainly declare their support or confidence, not for Anwar, but for somebody else. So I think the elements of instability are still there, and either parties or party coalitions or even individual MPs as a group could also effectuate such a change of government if they so desire. So indeed, Anwar is walking on very thin rope here in terms of holding on to his parliamentary majority. I think what is a saving grace is perhaps what was hinted just now by, I think by Bridget and also Zaim. Namely, there's this, the elites of this country would have to contend with, shall we say, new choices. Whereas previously it's essentially between the more establishment BN and the more reformist PKR and Pakatan Harapan. Nowadays is perhaps the more reformist Pakatan together with BN versus shall we put it, conservative elements of this country, and whereas certain elites may previously favor a more establishment type of governmental setup, they might not necessarily like to see a more conservative force coming to power in Malaysia. So that perhaps it's one, I wouldn't say saving grace, but I think it's one mitigating factor for the stabilization of Anwar's government. And we will soon see, of course, as mentioned, the various state elections as testing grounds as to whether this sort of conservative onslaught would continue. The economy, it's of course something to grapple, but frankly speaking, until now, I don't quite know what sort of new and hopefully more effective economic or socio-economic policies that the Anwar government would roll out, as opposed to what have been done over the past 2 or even 4 years. So I think going forward for Anwar, first thing is to stabilize his government as much he could. And ironically, that would entail, for example, in the cabinet lineup that hopefully will be announced in a few hours' time, that he could make his coalition partners happy about their appointments. But then there's this thing about slimming down the cabinet, which might not be very compatible with keeping the coalition intact. So that's something else that Anwar would have to grapple with. I think I will stop here first and then welcome questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Isan. You mentioned, and I think a very important point, that Malaysia is not unique. If you look at the global trend, the world is shifting to the right. In many ways, populist right. Look at Germany, Israel, UK, where governments do not have a strong commanding lead. Even in the presidential election was very close between Trump and Biden. Even in the midterms elections, it was extremely close between Democrats and Republicans, a 50-50, even in the Senate, even at the House, is almost 50-50. And some are saying in the US is a silent, is a cold civil war of the 21st century. And I think in many ways Malaysia has not reached that level, but I think we are reaching a very toxic environment where folks on the both left and right, conservative and liberal, do not want to speak to each other. They are blocking each other. They are insulting each other to very extreme rhetoric. And I think Malaysia is not unique in that sense. You mentioned about the fact that touching on the issues in the campaign, that voters were not satisfied with BN, especially corruption cases, but also many Malay voters did not want to vote for Pakatan Harapan because of supposedly DAP being too liberal. You mentioned also, and I think very interestingly, that it's because Anwar Ibrahim supposedly has the two-thirds majority. We don't know yet. Once we test it in December, but do not be surprised if that falls, just like Shafiq Abdul's state government did in 2020. You also mentioned about the elite, and I think maybe the question, if we have time, will be a little bit about the elite. I don't know whether the elite is a euphemism for something else beyond politicians, but I think it's very interesting use of the word elite because they mean different things to different people. Obviously, not referring to any conspiracy theories. But you also mentioned, and I think towards the end, you mentioned about the economic policy, that this is an important issue for the government, which they have acknowledged. Anwar has acknowledged that as a key number one issue for his government. But whether his policy would substantially differ from the previous governments is yet to be seen. But he does need to stabilize the government in the short term. So let's jump into some questions. And I also, in the interest of time, I also want to open the chat on Facebook as well as on Zoom. For folks that have questions, in the chat, I will read them out because it'll be easier that way. But let me jump quickly, and I want to get both of your thoughts in the lead up to the election. A lot of people are asking, how in the world did we get to this hung parliament? Specifically, many people are bewildered with the green wave that obviously started from the north and now has creeped up all the way to the middle of the peninsula, and maybe might creep down to the southern tip of Johor. I want to ask the both of you in terms of how how did we reach to this hung parliament? What do you think maybe some of the factors that you would emphasize as leading to the GE15 results? Maybe I'll start with Professor Bridget Welsh, and then I'll go to Dr. Insan.
I think we need to be cautious not to overinterpret the PN result as a green wave. That's my first point. I think that there are large sections of PAS who supported PAS, and I have been looking and arguing this. And if you read my research and the election prediction, I made that very clear. I think that that PAS has gained from a combination of sociological forces as well as being in government, be that the rise of strengthening of Islamic schools, the provision of social services, particularly childcare, but not only that, the role of being resources that come into being government, the narrative that they engage. I think that the populist campaigning that they have inspired, not only the racialized dimension of that, but also the sense of place and position. I mean, they provide. I think we have to be cautious to not be overly negative of the reasons why people voted for PAS. It's not just a negative vote, right? It was also a vote for a fair Islamic society, a sense of a profession of their faith. Their PAS supporters are an integral part of Malaysian society. They deserve the respect of being part of that in that context. And these combination of sociological forces I think were very powerful. I do feel, however, that the PN result does include people who voted for Muhyiddin, who voted for the context of COVID. People voted for. I think they were less risky. As 2018, people made huge risks. They voted for the unknown. In 2022, people voted for risk change, but the safer option, the non-UMNO in this context. So, and I think COVID was very much an integral part of that, but also the huge resources, and particularly the way that campaigns have changed in Malaysia. They've changed and become more professional campaigns. PN's was most important, but also this is a campaign on TikTok. People look for, the media looks at trauma and they go to the trauma. That's not where the action is. The action is on social media and people's friends supporting friends. I mean, I interviewed thousands of voters, and the people will say, well, I voted for PN because my friends are voting for PN, or I voted for PN because of what I saw of the role of influencers. And so I think, I will look more carefully at the data results in the more analytical analysis to sort of quantify that in terms of how much of this is a green wave and how much of this is a product of other forces of voting for a kind of non-UMNO and voting for Muhyiddin. But I would say for large parts of the West Coast where PAS made gains, or PN made gains, I think the other factors were really driving it. I mean, many a time people told me they received small amounts of money, and these were token amounts, but they are for younger people, they were very important. The pivotal younger people in particular were a driver of a lot of the support for PN. And we can, in my early analysis that I've looked at of the polling stations and the Salaran results so far that I've been able to see, and it's still early days, we can definitely see these trends in the voting data.
Very good. And I think you mentioned something important, that we cannot oversimplify the results as simply as one factor. And I think that's dangerous. I think in many ways, when I remember that night, Saturday night, people were saying, only 18 has messed up the country because of the TikTok influence, and young people overwhelmingly voted for PN because of the influence on TikTok. But actually, I don't think it works like that. I think there is a multi-factor, causes. I think there are many reasons why people voted for, Perikatan Nasional and didn't vote for Barisan Nasional. and many people voted for people forget that Pakatan Harapan actually, as a coalition, garnered the most votes. But I think many people are spooked up, I think, by what they saw as the rise of Perikatan Nasional at the expense of Barisan Nasional. I want to pass to Dr. Isan as you. What do you think?
I do want to interject just one comment on Undi 18 before you move to Isan.
Please go ahead.
One could make the argument that the opposite was actually, it's the older elites that have actually messed up the country from the way that they've used the narrative. And it's the young people who were trying to make change, but were constrained by the option they were given. So we can see the arguments different ways.
Good point. Isan, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another airport announcement here. I see it as more of a shift of emphasis in terms of identity politics, because in this country, the Malay Muslim identity, it's sort of one and the same. It's sort of fused. If you look at the results in 2013 or 2018, there were about, let's say, 75 to 80% of Malay voters voting for either UMNO or, for example, PAS at that time. And of course, during those elections, a larger portion of these Malay voters would vote for UMNO, and a smaller portion would vote for PAS. And at the moment, I see it as, I wouldn't say same cohort, but the proportion of this change, the proportion change, namely, there are more Malay voters voting for PAS versus Malay voters voting for UMNO, because I think the identity has been, in a sense, shifted a bit from a more racialized one to a more religious one. For those who still prefer emphasis on the racialized identity, there's also the sort of the votes going from UMNO to Bersatu. So UMNO experienced, in a sense, a double whammy. There's this shift of emphasis from the more racialized identity to a more religious identity, although they are one and the same. But also, even within the racialized identity, there's a shift from UMNO to Bersatu. On the other hand, Pakatan Harapan has yet to make significant inroads into the Malay heartlands and the larger groups of more conservative Malay voters. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Isan. And you're absolutely right. I think there are actually empirical studies to show that I think there is a rising conservatism among Malaysians, including young people, and that they are becoming more religious. But also, this is not a unique phenomenon to Malaysia. It's actually happening across the world. Identity politics actually manifest beyond race and religion. If you look at Brexit, the idea of Euroscepticism and British nationalism was one of the key factors for the vote. I want to jump into the questions in the Q&A, and then maybe we can jump to other questions that we discussed earlier. But I see three questions. Obviously, the second one by Sufi Muhammad is, I think, a really interesting question. I think this is a question that people are asking today: is will appointing Zahid as DPM help stabilize Anwar's premiership? I think this is a very interesting question. I don't know who wants to take a step with this, but if anyone wants to go and
let Isan go first on this one.
Well, at the moment, it would appear that Zahid is the leader of the UMNO faction, the mainstream faction in UMNO, which is more favorable to working with Pakatan Harapan as opposed to PN. So with all his cases and so on, appointing him as a deputy prime minister, it's a difficult decision. And if you do not do that, then you really have to appoint somebody perhaps much to the liking of Zahid Hamidi. Yeah.
Good point. Professor, would you ask on anything?
I think that the issue of Zahid points to, you know, how you think about where the sources of delegitimation come from and the forces of instability, right? No question, in terms of the issues of the elites, Zahid brings in more numbers, although in some ways he also he polarizes UMNO for those that who oppose him within the 30 members and many within the party itself who rightly blame his leadership for a lot of their losses. It's not the only factor, but it is a major factor, especially how he handled the relations, the issue of warlords, the issue of the campaign messaging, you know, and he himself became a polarizing figure for the party. I think that you know, Zahid being empowered by getting a position in the cabinet would in a sense polarize and really create divisions within UMNO that will make that, which already is, but make that issue a problem for stability for the Anwar government across the spectrum. The other factor is that Zahid immobilizes. It will really undermine Anwar with his political base. Well, I think that many are more, you know, as people recognize that they say, you know, working with UMNO is work better than working with PN. Some people have that position, right? Others may have a different position. But what I would say that they may look at things pragmatically, but Malaysians, especially Harapan space, are full of, you know, idealists. There's a lot of people who are, and the issues of principles and issues of corruption have been driving that particular coalition in terms of its support base for decades. And I think the Zahid appointment would help to undermine that. And I think we learned that that in Pakatan 1.0, we saw a situation where the fall from grace of disappointment and cynicism was very significant, and that one of the biggest lessons of Harapan 1.0 is that they didn't keep their political base. And it took until GE15 for them to recover that political base. So I think that this is a difficult quagmire, you know, in that context. My own personal view is that there are better ways to bring Zahid support into cabinet, as Ihsan has implied, than without bringing Zahid Hamidi into cabinet in that particular point, because it will become the focal point of attention, especially among Harapan supporters. Will it happen? You know, you've heard intensive conversations. You know, I think that let me just say that it's not good for Malaysia to have him there, because he personifies the corruption dimensions or the perceptions of corruptions. He has to go through his cases first. And I think this is true of all of the leaders who are facing corruption cases. They need to go through their corruption cases first before they're put into positions of power. I think that that's better for the country, and it provides us option. But of course, we know in Malaysia that the what's good is not always what happens. But I think I emphasize that, you know, Zahid's presence will limit and constrain issues of reform in very significant ways.
And it's a good point, both of you mentioned. I think having Zahid and maybe other, to like for you know, use a word, kleptocrats or the court cluster in the cabinet can actually destabilize the Anwar government. And I think this is actually a key point. Even in the question and answer, I take from Chief Kam on the point of instability. And I want to ask about the government is a unity government. Anwar Ibrahim is trying to please everyone, but in the end will please no one. And obviously having this unholy alliance between Pakatan Harapan and Barisan Nasional, which are ideologically very different. Does this bode well politically for both political coalitions? Specifically, if you look at the state elections coming next year, because my sense is I don't think it will, but I want to, you know, get your views on what do you think are the political implications for the coalitions, not so much government, but for the coalitions as they go into the state elections. Will this actually hurt both Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan, despite now supposedly collaboration on the state level, will this actually hurt their chances and eliminate their political base? Maybe we can go with Isan, and then we'll go to Professor Bridget Welsh.
Hi. I think at this point, we are not sure whether this coalition government would, in a sense, extend to the state levels. I mean, beyond the Pahang and Perak, would it extend to, for example, in the next Selangor state election, then between BN and also Pakatan Harapan, there will be some form of allocation of seats so that they would not overlap each other in their candidates. And if that is the case, on the surface, of course, it's going to sort of favor their chances of getting elected versus, let's say, Perikatan. But of course, at least in Malaysia, I think in many other places as well, there's also this phenomenon of pulling your legs, right? I mean, those, let's say it's a BN seat, but Pakatan gets to put up a candidate, and then the BN machinery may or may not support that candidate, or may even try to sabotage that candidate, and vice versa. That unfortunately happens, I think, quite often and a lot in my home state of Sabah. So let's see whether they would actually extend their collaboration down to the state level, or would it be like last time, I think in the 1980s, there was this Parti Bangsa Dayak Sarawak. It was in a federal coalition, but at the state level, it was opposition party, for example. I think we are not so clear about what kind of arrangement yet. In Sabah, for example, I roughly counted all the state assembly persons and so on, because both GIS and Barisan, they are supporting the federal government. If they extend that kind of collaboration down to the state level, then the only opposition member left in Sabah would be the appointed or nominated past assemblyman. So is that a good thing, having only, let's say, one opposition member in the state? I think that's also something we need to think about. Thanks.
Interesting point. Then the past president not even elected, is appointed. Professor Bridget Welsh, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a piece coming out and that I'm finishing up on Sabah. And one of the things that's at the parliamentary level, the only opposition is really PN, Belaran and others. So it's quite interesting to see how the political landscape is changing. Let me just answer your question two different ways. The first of all, I think that we've been focusing our conversation on the elite level. I think that the stability of this government will be determined how it manages the economy, and how it manages and how it's able to deliver on certain things. So I think that if there can be a common platform on certain sets of policy areas, you're going to see traction of where these elite issues of this person being in that person are less important than the focus on what is the actual deliverables. On a positive side, there is low expectations. I mean, people recognize the difficulties of things that are happening. So therefore, the space to have some concrete deliverables are there. I think that the BN and Harapan do have common ground. And I think on many sets of policy or areas, there were lots of very interesting conversations about, the social safety net, the issues of GST. There are lots of potential space to kind of coordinate some arenas from a perspective of this. So I think, when I look at the state elections, it's going to be what are the deliverables that we've seen in the first 6 months that will be very pivotal, as opposed to the alliance relationships. Now, I do think the alliance relationships are important. If we took the national results, so what we saw in GE15, we would see a very different configuration. We could see a hung parliament in just taking the national results. results, and then taking them through. We could see a hung parliament in hung state assembly in Selangor. We would see a very ethnically polarized situation in the context of Penang, especially a divide between the mainland and the island. We could see kind of a regional divide that would happen there. We would see a very interesting strengthening of PN in the states that are actually in Kedah Kelantan, and Terengganu, and we would also see potentially a hung assembly in the context of Negeri Sembilan if we just extended those results. What is quite interesting is that there is already conversations ongoing for an party alliance, which is already being tested in Tioman. Let's keep in mind, this is not even 2 weeks before after the election, so we've seen profound, rapid shifts that are taking place. The cooperation that is extending in Perak and Pahang is also extending to Negeri Sembilan and into Selangor. We are seeing new types of relationships emerging, and I think we may end up seeing very different relationships. The question is how much that can survive. I think UMNO as a party is at a very pivotal point, and its access to government, access to resources are very important for the party's longevity, so that there are vested interests for individuals as well as the party to foster a alliance, a working alliance with Harapan. I do see, Sabah is a very different case. We have a very different type of dynamic. What I see is a lot of the coalition actors joining to keep this government in Sabah stable as opposed to change it. We can see those factors in a different way. But I do see the state elections as very fascinating as an illustration of the evolution of the shifts that are taking place. My main concern, however, is that the narrative that PN is using is one that is actually highly emotive. People vote. The campaign, you asked earlier, why are people voting in particular ways? They vote because the focal point is on identity politics, because the politicians have not ratcheted their game up to talk about policies in a meaningful way. And to talk about what sort of solutions to the problems that people face. They list them in the manifestos, but they don't really discuss them in meaningful ways. And I think that the role of identity politics is still very salient because it's something that is continued socialized of politicians that use that. And we can see, if the Anwar's government does not perform well on the economy, then the focal point for a more populist anti-agenda and the use of racialized politics gains even more traction. I think it speaks poorly of PN that they have to rely so exclusively on this type of racial mobilization and use of resources in the way that they have. But it also is, we have to recognize that this is a reality that is effective in the context of that. So that's why they're doing it, in this area. So I see the state elections as fascinating, but I also think we have to be careful not to recognize that we may see a very different circumstances. That's why when I say to investors and others that the next 6 months, in particular the next 8 months, are really going to be testing times for this government. In this context, I think that it can move in many different directions, including, for example, the PN coalition itself being dissatisfied with each other. So don't rule out all sorts of sets of options that can emerge.
And it's a good point you mentioned that we cannot extrapolate the GE15 results to the state elections because the state elections are now not held concurrently with the federal elections, and therefore could be more localized as opposed to focusing on national issues. And also you mentioned importantly that the economy matters. Maybe I was a bit of a policy wonk, thinking that is the economy stupid, but obviously there are other factors at play. I mean, if you look at the economy, even GDP is very high. Recorded the highest GDP growth in the region in the third quarter. Unfortunately, if you look at on the ground, there's over 2.4 million people now unemployed, 7,000 are unemployed. Numbers don't look that great because of the pandemic, of course. And I think one of the things that Ramli, Deputy President, tried to push during the election was to move away from identity politics, saying that this will only affect people at the hardcore supporters of the parties and focus on economy, which will be the deciding factor for the fence sitters that would vote for the parties. On this note, I want to touch on a question by Sufi Muhammad on budget 2023. Obviously, a lot has been discussed in the first Friday of October, and obviously that budget was tabled but not debated or even passed. The question I think is interesting is how should the new government amend budget 2023 that was previously tabled by the express of the administration in being the popularity of the new government and stabilizing relationship with the community government. And I think this is a very interesting question as we're moving forward because Anwar Ibrahim has said that he wants to table the budget next month. What are your thoughts on this? How should the government amend, or how different should it be for the Anwar Ibrahim government? Professor Bajwa, I know you said you can answer this live. Maybe I'll pass it to you now because I'll give it to you.
I think that one of the questions earlier by Sufi was that should Anwar get through Parliament? I think that he probably will, but not quite with the numbers we expect. Maybe we'll see how that evolves. It's still too many unknowns. In terms of the budget, there are three different areas that I think are very important. Number one, there needs to be a discussion of revenue sources, meaningful revenue areas, and I think that there's a lot less political space to talk about that. So I think that it's about basically convincing the markets that there is a real discussion about debt financing as well as of new potential taxes as something that's phased in. Second of all, Anwar government needs to brand and have a rebranding of the social safety net. Here is where I think the issues of basic income and others, besides cash transfer programs, offer different sets of alternatives. And number three, there needs to be a curbing of some of the project spending that exists within that. A lot of this was seen as a kind of, yes, we need pump priming in terms of the context of pushing money into the economy, but there's also needs to be a recognition of some of the realities in this particular area. This budget has to be amended because it's a new government, this is an opportunity for Anwar Ibrahim's government to brand his government and to address some of the particular areas. I don't think some of the things that were promised in terms of civil service and spending and the other areas are going to change, but there's also potential areas where things are going to be added on or transformed or repackaged. It's really about changing fiscal redistribution patterns and just redistributing the budget in a slightly different way. And I think that this is a tremendous opportunity. It has to be passed very quickly, from the perspective of the next period of time, because Anwar is on, he's on a clock, he's on a tight clock, and I think this is important to look at.
Absolutely agree with what you mentioned. Anwar Ibrahim has to stamp his brand on the budget 2023. Isan, I'll pass to you. I need to interest of time.
Yeah, that's why we need the finance minister as soon as possible, because the finance minister will have a learning curve, assuming he is not any of our previous finance ministers. He or she would have a steep learning curve, and then in a very short period of time, I think we are talking about, let's say, a month, at most two, he or she would have to present a budget to Parliament, and that budget would have to include all these wonderful elements mentioned before. So I think a lot of eyes in the markets are looking indeed as to who would be the finance minister, because Anwar would be in a sense preoccupied with all this political wrangling, trying to keep his coalition intact, hopefully not falling as some of his predecessor governments. So he would need to have somebody who is competent, who is perhaps a bit renowned, or at least well known to the market as a steady hand to usher in this new budget. And meanwhile, I think there needs to be some form of, I think it's called supplementary budget or something, to be passed so that the country could be run from a, let's say, month-to-month basis before the real big budget is presented. Yeah.
As in a mini budget, as an interim to financing it. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time. We are on the clock, but I want to ask one final question for both panelists. If as we look into the future, and I don't mean short term. I think if you look maybe 12 months ahead, a lot of people are anxious because of and I think one of the questions also mentioned about, will this government last? Because I think many people are traumatized by Langkah Sheraton move, and how governments can easily be toppled overnight. And I want to ask you, in terms of your political outlook for Malaysia, if you look at the crystal ball gazing in the next 12 months, beyond 12 months, where do you think Malaysia would be in terms of political outlook beyond 12 months? I want to, and I think this is a relevant question for our audience. Many of folks are from media, but also entrepreneurs and civil society organizations. Maybe I'll start with Professor Bashir Welsh, and then we'll end with Dr. Barisan.
Well, I think we've learned in Malaysia that we should be very careful of making predictions. Even if we try to get the predictions, we should be conservative about them, which is what I try to do in my own analysis on the elections, to look at what could happen. I do feel that I do feel that, all things being equal, the royalty has played a very stabilizing role in this context. And I think that they've given, ironically, a green light to Anwar Ibrahim's government for at least a period of time. And so while I do believe that there will be destabilizing influences that continue, I think that there are vested interests of wanting to keep that stability from the perspective of this period of as much as possible. So from 12 months' time, I think we may see a situation where we are likely to have a government, the same government, but perhaps with different actors. So that's the most likely situation. But I don't rule out the possibility of a new coalition forming. But I would say that, one of the reasons why PN was not successful of forming government, besides the personality dynamics and issues that happened in this power transition in terms of responding, how Muhyiddin, for example, responded to the unity government, is that PN doesn't have as much confidence in the international markets as a coalition, and I think, and it also doesn't have the breadth of representation. Notwithstanding that GPS would have supported it, but I'm talking about all of Malaysia, and more of Malaysia from a perspective of multi-ethnic type of composition and others. So, the fact is that even if a new coalition came in, it's not the COVID time where you could put things down and you could have a stabilization process. It's that people who think that it's going to be the similar circumstances would in fact actually not see that. It's not that circumstances, and so that's why I weigh in the balance of Anwar's government surviving the year. I think it will be battered. I'm realistic about this, especially if you don't have a good team. It cannot be only about Anwar Ibrahim, it has to be about the Malaysian people and the focus on the issues of deliverables.
Such a nuanced view. Oisan, over to you.
Surviving for this year, I think it's almost certain. Surviving beyond this year, I think would indeed takes a lot of political effort from Anwar, how he would balance between his desire, for example, for a slimmer cabinet, for a more reformist form of government, versus, for example, some of the old habits of UMNO, of getting, for example, projects and so on. And if those projects are not forthcoming, then there could be some other ways of thinking. Again, I think the sort of mitigating factor is sort of this collective fear. I think, well, collective fear among a large group of elites, that, for example, if the other side were to take over, it would usher in somewhat irreversible, well, quote unquote, reforms that might not be very conducive to their vested interests and so on. I think that could be the main mitigating factor. But how long that sort of mitigating factor could last if the economy for next year is projected to be even worse than this year, then there will be a popular demand for more distributive social economy. Then the PN brand of more distributive social economy would sound more appealing to people, and then there could be a groundswell of support for that sort of government, perhaps in coalition, let's say with some within the current coalition. So I similarly would not make the very far-reaching prediction beyond saying that Anwar need to roll out his budget, his socio-economic policy soon in order to address this downward spiraling economy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Isan and Professor Bishop Welsh. I think you presented a very well-balanced view of what's been happening, making sense of GE15, demystifying myths, and also correcting misperceptions that many of us have of what has been happening. And I think a rather emotional time for many Malaysians, only because of the fact that we care for the country and not because we hate the other side. I think regardless of which side we are on, I think a lot of Malaysians do care. And I think in a positive sign, I think the country has gone through a period of further democratization compared to our friends in the region. I think Malaysia has actually made a lot of progress on the democratic front, maybe not so much on the economic front, but hopefully, like both of you mentioned, I think the government has its work cut out for itself as it navigates through the economic headwinds next year. Conscious that we are 10 minutes behind time, so with that, I want to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Isan and Professor Bishop Welsh, for taking time to be with us, and hopefully we'll have both of you in one of our many events in the future. So thank you so much, and hope to see you both of you soon. And thank you for folks attending and participating, and thank you for your questions. Hope to see you soon. Visit www.kasi.asia for more information of events. And until then, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.